Good afternoon. I'm Sylvester Johnson, Director of the Center for Humanities at Virginia Tech, and I want to thank you for joining our Faculty Research Colloquium today. I want to give a special thanks to Joe Fort, who directs the Athenaeum, the digital hub at Virginia Tech, and to Dominique Francesca, the business manager for the Center for Humanities, for their work in making this event possible. And a quick announcement about future talk on Monday, April 25th, at the same time, Professor Dina Smith-Glavenia will present her work on the historical recreation and interpretation in reenactment dress. So please mark your calendars for that. Today, we are joined by Professor Marian Mollin, who is presenting on Ida Ford and the Spirit of Social Change. Dr. Mollin is an associate professor of history at Virginia Tech. She's a historian of gender, social movements, and political protests. This is an interest that was spurred by her experiences as a political organizer and as an activist in anti-war Central American solidarity, social justice, and environmental causes. Her research, broadly framed, explores the connections between identity, activism, culture, and religion in the 20th century United States. And she's currently writing a book that is a biography of Marian's sister, Ida Ford. So we're very excited to have you with us today. I'd like to remind our audience, those of you who are attending, that we are inviting your questions and your comments. And we'll stop about halfway through our program today to hear from you. But you can send us those questions or comments at any time. You will click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window, and you can send those to us. But we look forward to engaging with you later. So without further ado, Professor Mollin will be presenting on Ida Ford and the Spirit of Social Change. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Great. Thank you so much. First, I want to just thank Sylvester and the Center for the Humanities for this opportunity to share my ongoing research with an audience. And also thank you to everyone who's taking time out of their busy, stressful schedules to come and listen to my presentation. As much as I would like the book that this research is a little slice of to be done, this is still very much a work in progress. So I'm eager for your questions and feedback when this is all over. Let me share my screen. Just 1 second. There we go. This is a photograph of Ida Ford, who is the topic of my research. Ida, who was a native Brooklynite, spent her life as a talented and devoted and devout, but fairly unknown Catholic sister until early December 1980, when she and 3 other US churchwomen were abducted, raped, and murdered by members of the El Salvadorian National Guard. And this was a picture of that event that appeared across the nation in the days that followed. Because the US at that time sent significant funding and support to the El Salvadorian government and military, Ford's death became headline news and instantly politicized. And this is Ida right there. They were buried in a shallow grave after they were killed and then discovered and disinterred. El Salvador in 1980 was a small country on the verge of civil war between a repressive military regime and mass organizations fighting for economic justice and basic civil rights. El Salvador had basically become a proxy fight in the larger cold between the US and the USSR. And Ida and her fellow churchwomen found themselves caught in the middle of this. She was killed in early December 1980, and in January 1981, Ronald Reagan became president. And his incoming administration instantly politicized the churchwomen's murders. For example, Jeane Kirkpatrick, the US ambassador designate to the United Nations at the time, insisted that, quote, the nuns were not just nuns, the nuns were also political activists, end quote. Alexander Haig, Reagan's Secretary of State, publicly blamed the women for their own deaths and falsely insinuated that they had been in a firefight with the police. So we start seeing articles like this that talk about kind of the Marian order and kind of how they've been wrapped up in this political controversy. Now, I should say that the families of the four U.S. churchwomen and the Marian sisters as a congregation loudly and repeatedly denied that the women and their work as foreign missioners in El Salvador were quote unquote political. They made that claim at the time, including when they testified before Congress, and they continue to make that claim that they are not political. As the Marian sisters explained almost a decade after Ford's death, they believe that characterizing the work as political activism does not express our motivation and approach. It appears to obscure the prophetic role of the missioner. It just does not ring true. My presentation today is part of my own effort to understand the sisters' perspective on Ford and her work, and to explore the ways in which characterizing Ida's life and work as quote unquote political activism can be seen as not ringing true. This is a bit of a challenge for me and many other historians of the 20th century US who have embraced a very secular analysis of historical forces, looking at politics, economics, culture, society, and people who often study religion. Historians tend to do it, at least those of us who do contemporary US history, study religion as a quasi-secular force, focusing on the power of religious institutions, networks, and leaders, but rarely push analysis of religious belief and faith into the center of our analysis. We tend to look at it as nothing more than kind of quaint superstition. And I think I've been thinking about this a lot, and kind of just the whole characterization of how US society became more secular, and therefore our analysis is more secular. I also have to say, as a secular Jew, coming to terms with Ida's Catholic faith has been more than mystifying at times. But I have begun to take ideas about religious belief and faith seriously, not just as a sideshow, but as a central part of the history I'm exploring through my biography of Ida's life and death. In large part because faith was central to her being throughout her life. Ida understood that her actions had political implications, but for her, the work she did as a foreign missioner, first in Chile and then in El Salvador, I'll talk about those in a little more depth. Her work she did as a foreign missioner were all about living her faith. So in essence, what I'm going to do in this presentation is explore the spiritual dimensions of Ida's life and work by answering two questions. And the first, how did Ida think about her spirituality and her faith? And then second, I'll explore how did Ida put her faith into practice as a foreign missioner. So first, a little bit about Ida, and here's another photograph of her so you can imagine her a little bit. Ida was born in Brooklyn in 1940 in a solid Irish Catholic family that was devout, but also deeply engaged in the world around them. She joined Marian Sisters, which was is still a religious order dedicated to the work of foreign mission. And she joined there after she graduated from college in 1961. She went through her training there and then left for medical reasons in 1964, and then 1971. During those interim years between 64 and 71, Ida lived in Greenwich Village and was involved in many of the forces and movements of the 1960s. She went to anti-war protests. She supported Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers. She did anti-poverty work. Then she returned to Marian in 1971, had a few more years of training, and then early 1980, she served in mission in Chile. She arrived in Santiago, Chile, just a few months before the US-backed coup that violently toppled democratically elected President Salvador Allende. And then she settled in a shanty town in Santiago, where she worked with those who suffered economically, socially, and politically under Augusto Pinochet's repressive military regime. In March 1980, she embarked on her second mission assignment to El Salvador at the invitation of Archbishop Oscar Romero. And she lived there for a very difficult 8 months until she was disappeared and murdered by the El Salvadoran military that December. I have come to understand that spirituality as a set of relationships stood at the center of Ida's conception of faith. And this is a picture of her at the beginning of her religious career as a novice at the Marian Sisters in New York's Hudson River Valley. This idea of religion as relational was how she characterized her calling really early in her career when she was just a young woman. She literally described it as, quote, a process of realizing our relationships between ourselves and God. This idea, this relationship between herself and God, it stood at the center of how she pursued her religious vocation. And it was not only Ida who felt this way. Orientation for the Marian Sister novices from the early 1970s, for example, also emphasized the concept of, quote, prayer as relational, the totality of a person communicating with God in the full climate of community living and apostolic involvement. And I love this picture of her with her fellow novices because it gives a sense of that community that was so important to her as part of her spiritual practice. Now, in this way, Ida and the Marian Sisters affirm what historian and religious studies scholar Robert Orsi describes of religion, quote, as a network of relationships between heaven and earth. He describes religion, spirituality as, quote, involving humans of all ages and many different sacred figures together. These relationships, he asserts, have all the complexities of relationships between humans. And then he also emphasizes, quote, the realness of sacred presence in the imaginations and experiences of religious practitioners. So this relationship with God that she was developing as a novice was very real to her. As Orsi argues, we should not dismiss Ida's or the Marian Sisters' descriptions of divine relations simply as colorful allegories or tropes. But I argue we should take them seriously as reflections of the realness of sacred presence in the imaginations and experiences of religious practitioners. So we need to assume that the Marian Sisters quite literally meant it when they wrote in their 1974 General Chapter Proceedings that, quote, in the rhythm of our prayer, there are moments in which God calls us to life, quietly, each by her own name. And we should not question Ida's sincerity when she described herself as called by God. Now, spiritual relationship building for Ida and the Marian Sisters not only required building a relationship with God, the whole reason that one would become a woman religious, but it also meant building people-to-people connections, both within their religious community and between themselves and the people they served in mission. So first I want to talk about relationships within the congregation. And this is a photo from the mid-1970s. Ida's here in the center, in the sweater, and she is with all of the sisters in the Chile region. So this is when she was in mission in Chile. Again, giving you a sense of the importance of community as part of their spiritual calling. Ida was in fact drawn to religious life because of its emphasis on community. It was one of the things that drew her back to Marian in 1971 after spending the latter part of the 60s involved in social justice work in New York City. By building a prefigurative version of the beloved community that they saw as designed to unify spirituality and social action, the Marian Sisters pursued the development of what they described as, quote, a world as God intends it to be, a world of justice and peace, end quote. So within this context, forging interpersonal and group connections served as an experience, an expression of religious belief. Now, this concept of communal faith manifested itself as well in the mutual relationships that the sisters and Ida developed with the people they served in mission. And this is a photograph of Ida in Chile with the people. She lived in a shanty town, and these are her neighbors in that shanty town. They were aided in this effort to really build community with the people they served by the ecclesial reforms that were instigated by Vatican II in the early 1960s, which redefined the church as quote unquote, the people of God, with all of its members part of a shared mystical body of Christ. So a sense that the church itself was a community. In Latin America, these teachings also led to the development of liberation theology and the church's stated preferential option for the poor. Catholic teaching and practice began to reflect the needs of the continent's oppressed and impoverished masses, and clergy and lay leaders used the Bible as a tool for reflection and action against poverty and injustice. Ida and the Marian sisters' practice of liberation theology, for example, meant that they literally saw themselves as being, quote, evangelized by the poor, end quote. And this is a photo of Maura Clark, who was Ida's companion sister towards the end of her time in El Salvador. Again, working closely, being with, developing relations with the people that they served. To explain this theological perspective of being evangelized by the poor that came out of liberation theology, the idea was that if you read the Bible carefully, that Jesus preached to the poor. So if you really wanted to understand Christ's message and to develop that relationship with God, you needed to have the poor, the people who heard that message firsthand, explain that message to you. And then through their words and also through their actions and their lived faith, you could allow yourself to get some understanding of who God really was and what God's message should be. So the sisters and Ida definitely saw this idea of being evangelized by the poor as central to their work. And they allowed themselves to have those relationships by living in their communities alongside them in shanty towns, and developing small d democratic forms of leadership. So in this way, personal and spiritual relationships came together in a powerful way. And this is, I want to end this section with this, just thinking about the way for her spirituality was just completely relational. Ida considered the people she worked with in the shanty town in Chile or in El Salvador, groups of refugees, these poor and politically oppressed people. She saw them as sacred conduits between herself and the Holy Spirit, people who helped facilitate her efforts to deepen her relationship with God. So now the question becomes, how did she put this relational understanding of faith into practice? And I would like to suggest that these sacred relationships she developed to God, to her sisters in community and congregation, and to the poor and oppressed people she worked with in mission, that these sacred relationships motivated Ida to put her faith into action in a very particular way. More specifically, it pushed her to engage in what theologian Walter Wink would later call resistance to the principalities and powers, social structures and institutions, violent prone systems of power and domination whose existence oppress and exploit people. So those are the principalities and power. And according to Walter Wink, these systems reflect a spiritual kingdom of evil that requires a spiritual response in the form of nonviolent resistance, that people need to unmask these powers, expose them for what they are as destructive to human and non-human life. And although Wink articulated these ideas a number of years after Ida's death, these sentiments really help describe Ida's experiences, her motivations, and her perceptions, the ways in which she saw her work as religious rather than political. Now, in both Chile and El Salvador, excuse me, the principalities and powers that Ida confronted were the structures of the state. And in El Salvador, they were also the structures of paramilitary forces related to the state and the economic elite. And her interpretation as a spiritual, rather than political, purely political battle or conflict was justified in concrete ways. In Chile, when soldiers searched her home, they were looking for the Liberation Theology Bible, this La Biblia Latinoamericana. And in El Salvador, the church and its members were actively and openly persecuted by the militarized state because of the church's quote unquote preferential option for the poor. In both places, if you generally thought of the church as the people of God, then the oppression and suffering of those people was an affront to God itself. The way Ida resisted these powers was through her understanding of the spiritual kingdom of God through the work of accompaniment. And I want to just talk about accompaniment for a while because it was a way that brought together community building and spirituality for her while she was in Latin America. Ida and her companion sisters called accompaniment, quote, the great privilege of serving this suffering church, end quote. And this work of accompaniment, which was an outgrowth of 1960s era liberation theology, was made probably most tangible to them in the late 1970s by the work and homilies of El Salvadoran Archbishop Oscar Romero. Oscar Romero firmly and openly allied the Salvadoran church with the struggle of that nation's impoverished campesinos, which made him basically be deemed an enemy of the state. He was brutally assassinated by paramilitary units while serving mass. And his brutal assassination, Ida interpreted as part of the continuing reality of, quote, Christ's crucifixion. So again, seeing all this in very spiritual terms. But I want to go back to thinking about Romero and accompaniment. And this is one of many pictures of, again, he's the Archbishop of the nation, and he is literally visiting with and being with the poor and most oppressed people of El Salvador. The Marian sisters learned a lot from Romero, and Ita studied him extensively before going to El Salvador. And according to the Marian sisters, this idea of accompaniment, of quote unquote being with, they directly attributed those to Oscar Romero's words. They saw it as the pastoral task of being a companion on the way. And again, this idea that they saw themselves as coming to accompany a people in their suffering. So a very specific kind of relationship building. More concretely, accompaniment very specific things in Chile and El Salvador. In Chile, it meant for Ida living with the poor as the poor. And this is a photograph of the shanty town, La Bandera, where Ita lived during the 1970s. As one friend of hers chronicled, Ida, quote, and her companion sisters, quote, saw their mission not only as one of teaching the gospel to the poor, but rather of living the message of Christ in their midst, to attempt to share the lives of the Chilean pobladores, their neighbors in the shanty town where they lived. So they lived literally in a wooden shack in the middle of the shanty town. And then they helped to foment relationships and establish structures of community empowerment. And these are pictures of Ida with the people of La Bandera. While she was there, they established feeding kitchens to help make sure that at least the children had food every day, craft groups for fundraising, mental health support groups to help people trying to live through the trauma of the military regime. Ida also worked with the church-sponsored Comité por Paz, which searched for the disappeared, advocated for and visited political prisoners. And basically this committee was the only institutional force in Chile speaking out against the abuses of the military dictatorship. So for her, accompaniment meant both the social service work and the work supporting political prisoners. And again, she saw this as integrally tied to her spiritual mission. When she moved to El Salvador in 1980, accompaniment meant something different because the conditions were different. As I said, this was a country on the verge of civil war. And I actually don't have any photographs of Ida in El Salvador, but just some illustrative pictures so you can get a sense of the world she was living in there. In El Salvador, accompaniment meant going up into the mountains to deliver food and supplies and medicines to thousands of families who had fled their homes and were hiding away from their villages in fear. It meant transporting as many people as they could to informal refugee sites established by the Catholic Church. It meant driving priests to and from isolated hamlets and towns in order to officiate Mass. And perhaps most difficult, it meant helping to identify and bury bodies left by government and right-wing paramilitary forces in the roads and the fields, bodies that families were too afraid to identify and bury on their own because then that would label them as enemies of the state. And I just want to say, and I was mentioning this to Sylvester before we started, that what I've just described, what she experienced in El Salvador, I've been reminded of by the news stories coming out of Ukraine, especially from the villages north of Kyiv, of all the human rights abuses and the mass burials and the bodies in the streets, that what she was experiencing in El Salvador was very similar, only this was a government attacking its own people. In both Chile and El Salvador, this work of accompaniment obviously meant taking considerable risks. In Chile, her home was repeatedly searched by soldiers. She feared arrest, imprisonment, or worse. She thought she was prepared for El Salvador, but going to El Salvador was like jumping from the frying pan into the fire. And there she experienced the constant threat of violence, which ultimately resulted in her abduction and death. And this is another photograph of the disinterment of the churchwomen, where in this moment, she literally shared the fate of the people she accompanied. I want to go back to this idea of accompaniment because it was part of Ida's and the Marian sisters' spiritual practice. What they did was not simply aid work or political advocacy and organizing, but it was part and parcel of living their faith. Now, certainly both in Chile and El Salvador, she tried to put pressure on human rights organizations like the International Red Cross, and to get her friends to put pressure on US politicians to do whatever they could to ease the suffering that she saw on a daily basis. But I also think it's worth taking seriously the words and phrases that had the most meaning for her in order to understand what Ida thought she was really working for. When Ida and her companion sister Carla, they were together in Chile and then they went together to El Salvador. When they drove their battered Jeep through the countryside of El Salvador, transporting people and delivering food and medicine, their theme song, the tune they sang to inspire each other and keep going, was not the Internationale or some American or Latin American political protest song, but a song that Carla wrote, whose refrain began, "You are the Lord of the road," and whose words were a prayer to God for help in allowing them to see, hear, love, console, understand, and be in solidarity. In other words, they sang a prayer as they drove through the countryside. In the small room that served as a chapel for them in Chalatenango, they hung a banner that did not espouse a political slogan. There was nothing saying "El pueblo unido jamás será vencido" on the wall, but instead what it said was, "Father, I believe in your surprise for me today." Likewise, when sisters emptied Ida's room after her death, they found the following banner hanging over her bed. Quote, "Almighty and eternal God, our Father, your goodness is beyond what our spirit can touch, and your strength is more than our mind can bear. Lord, lead us to seek beyond our reach. Give us the courage to stand before your truth." So just a few concluding thoughts. From my perspective, we cannot deny that faith profoundly shaped Ida's action. This is a photo of Ida taken just before she died. She, and this is her companion sister at the time, Mora, were meeting, this is another group, in Nicaragua as part of the regional group. And then when she came back was when she was abducted and murdered. We can't deny that faith profoundly shaped her actions, that they provided spiritual rather than ideological or political rationale and motivation for engaging in behavior that fundamentally challenged entrenched structures of power in El Salvador especially, but also in Chile and even in the US. As modern or contemporary as Ida was, she was anything but secular in her approach to her work for social justice. My research into Ida's life, I think, complicates the way historians make sense of modern American history. It certainly encourages us as historians to view faith as more than just part of kind of the cultural milieu of their time, or as some irrational and irrelevant motivating factor for action. Instead, I'd like to argue that religion and spirituality provided an important avenue from which to engage with the world and the powers that be in a deeply significant and effective way. In Ida's hands, faith, in fact, could be political, just not in the traditional sense of the word, but through using a broader definition of politics, challenging the principalities and the powers in a spiritual way. And as such, her faith challenges the boundaries that historians often create between our studies of spiritual and secular forces, or in Robert Orsi's words, between the work of heaven and earth. With that, we can open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Mollin. So we have one question already from the audience that is asking about the categories of religious and political. And it's that for many, Ida's commitment to nonviolent resistance against forms of power and solidarity with the poor following a liberation theology would be seen by many to count as political. And so this person is asking, do you think it might be the case that Ida Ford was deliberately avoiding the label of being political because, as you just explained to us, of the environment in which she was operating, there could be very lethal consequences. And in fact, as you have explained very tragically, she was murdered because of her activism. So the question is, do you think this was a deliberate choice by her, not so much that she didn't think the religious could be political, but that she was trying to be strategic, or are those categories legitimately kept apart by her in the way of representing her work? So could you comment on this?
Yeah, so it's really complicated. And she really grappled with this. I don't have like a nice, tidy answer. So she and the sisters completely understood the political implications of what they were doing, even though they cast it as religious and spiritual. And I actually believe, so I've been really grappling with this. So, and Ida even writes, she does this interview with this reporter from Pacifica Radio towards the end of her time in El Salvador. And she actually says, she gives this very astute political analysis of what's going on. And then she says, we have to take sides. Like, you can't not take sides. But I think for her, the not taking sides was that she couldn't live up to her faith and not take sides. So it's complicated, right? But she really saw herself like she was on the side of the people that she thought Christ was on the side of, whatever their political anything. And they tried to be consistent with this. Carla actually died that August. They were there before Ida was murdered. They were taking someone who was actually a spy for the government away from their village and bringing him back home, kind of trying to live consistent with that. And they were caught in a flash flood. But I don't know, Nick, if this is really answering your question. So she didn't see herself as associated with the guerrilla movement. She really saw herself as associated with the people who were the enemy of the state. The other piece of this, of course, in El Salvador, the church had declared the state had declared the church an enemy of the state. They murdered the archbishop, the local leader general at the National Guard office that was literally catty corner on the plaza to the church where she lived, told him that he thought they were subversive, that the church was subversive. She was on a death squad list. And so there's the political implication, but I think to miss the spiritual part of it misses a lot of what was motivating her. And again, I'm just trying to understand her. So Nick, I don't know if that answers your question or not. If it doesn't, you can ask a follow-up.
Thanks very much. There's another question that's asking how you began to engage with this research, and it's such an amazing and important area of work.
Thank you for the question. So this research came out of my own life history and my previous research. I see myself as a scholar of gender and social movements. And I was actually a political organizer in the 10 years before I went to graduate school in the 1980s. I did political organizing. And I did a lot around Central America solidarity work. And one of my best friends, still really close friend, was a niece of Ida Ford. And her father, my friend Miriam's father, had been a Wall Street attorney. And when his sister was murdered, he basically became a human rights lawyer, trying to pursue justice for his sister. So I came at it wanting to write about activism in a slightly different way than I had in my first book. And so I've been casting Ida in this kind of framework of activism as well. And I have written other work that describes his sisters as kind of a bridge between nonviolent social movements in the US and Latin America. That they were involved, they were trained by some of them trained by Saul Alinsky, they were at front lines of Selma, they're at the beginnings of liberation theology in Peru, and they kind of bring that cultural baggage with them. So started seeing her as the social representative of a kind of social movement networking, but realized that I needed to dig further into what made her tick to try to really figure out what was going on. So Nick does have a follow-up question. Okay. All right.
Well, I think, yeah, he was saying that your response did answer the question.
Yeah.
But so I have a good interesting issues. We're talking science. Could you talk about that in the connections with the way the violence is represented in media?
Sorry, Sylvester, you got frozen up on me a little bit. So I missed your question. Maybe you could type your question in.
Yes.
Am I freezing up or just you?
No, you're okay. Are you able to hear me now?
Yeah, I am.
Okay, so I was asking, what difference does it make, the state violence make, for the way the media represents the violence? Because I think it's fair to say that in the U.S., there's not enough of the nature of state repression in Latin America, particularly the way they use that.
Look, you're still freezing up on me. But yeah, so you and I were talking a little bit about this before we started. Like, who gets represented as like sympathetic victims of state violence? And as I mentioned to you, it's been making me a little crazy, because the pictures I just showed you in the slideshow are very much like what's coming out north of Kyiv. And in 1980, hardly anybody saw them in the US, saw them as sympathetic. You know, there was a movement, solidarity movement, but they're seen as other, as different, as somehow less deserving. So yes, and the Marian sisters were politicized as well in Tanzania. I can talk about that in a minute. I don't know about in terms of how violence gets represented in the media. You know, when Ida was killed, so this is like, again, one of those things that could make you a little crazy. You know, people were being killed all over El Salvador in late 1979, early 1980. And they didn't make it into the papers. But when 4 white US church women get killed, they're literally, those pictures I showed you were splashed on front pages of the Washington Post, the New York Times, Chicago Tribune. They're on TV, you know, like those 4 white women. I mean, and it was not something those women would have wanted, but they became the face of state violence in the United States. And so I'm not an expert on media, but it's certainly right. Like in this country, like the only people who count as sympathetic victims of state violence are white people that look like other white people. You know, and that was true in this country during the civil rights struggle. It's true, Black Lives Matter, right? Like, who are the sympathetic victims of violence? So I don't really know how to answer that question, except that it's really frustrating to see that kind of repeated again and again, because anyone who suffers deserves to be treated as human and deserves to be fought for. So Paula, you wrote about the Marian sisters were politicized, right? They sided with Nyeri's government, and they tried to bring liberation theology, help bring it to Africa as well. One of the people who I interviewed for this research, she recently died, Janice McLaughlin, had been in Southern Africa and got deported because of her political work, kind of right around the same time. So, and the Marian congregation in general was, I think, really instrumental in bringing the ideas of liberation theology to the United States through their publishing work. I was thinking, Sylvester, you were mentioning you had studied with James Cone, and I know he was, Marian has published some of his stuff, and they like, Marian was the first group to publish the stuff from the liberation theologians in English and things like that. So they're definitely working on expanding that. They're politicized, but this is like where it's complicated. They are adamant that they're not political, and it's just it's a complicated piece of the story. Are there other questions?
So I'm going to turn off my video in hopes that will have audio, but are you able to hear me?
You're still frozen, but I can hear you a little bit.
Yeah, so can you explain the relationship of the Latin American liberation theology to the larger world of Catholicism that existed during this period of time? So the
Yeah, looks like we completely lost Sylvester for now, but I can answer that question. So liberation theology grew out of Vatican II. So Vatican II were a set of reforms in the global Catholic Church, that series of conferences from 1963 to 1965. And they changed the whole way that church services were run. They got rid of the Latin Mass. And this idea, they expounded this idea of the church as quote unquote, the people of God. In other words, that the people, rather than just like elevating priests and clergy to this place where like the people who attended church were just masses, they saw the people in the church as kind of an integral part of the church, right? That everybody was the people of God. So this is percolating, Vatican II is percolating globally throughout the mid-1960s. I started answering the question before you came back. Throughout the mid-1960s. And there's a group of theologians from Latin America who are in Europe at the time. Gustavo Gutierrez is one of them, Peruvian theologians, and they begin playing with this theology in light of their experiences as Peruvians in the highlands, working with, you know, incredibly poor, oppressed people. And so they developed this theology of liberation in the mid-1960s. And the Marian sisters, as a congregation, they have a group that's in the Peruvian highlands at the same time that Gutierrez and these other theologians are developing liberation theology. So they actually get into it on the ground floor before it even has a name. And then in 1968 in Medellin, Colombia, the Latin American bishops met. And that was when like they basically adopt liberation theology and call for the church to have what they call a preferential option for the poor. Up until that point, the church in Latin America had been firmly allied with the elite. And so this was a huge break, and it happens differently in different Latin American countries. Some places like Brazil has a very progressive set of clergy, Peru, Chile, and then other countries like Argentina, the clergy were very conservative, didn't really adopt it, but it becomes part of, by 68, it becomes part of like mainstream Catholicism in many ways, because it's adopted by the bishops. And then the ideas of it are spread across the globe at that point. And people practice it in different ways. There was a lot about like building these small communities that would empower people basically to read the Bible. And instead of being taught that, right, like your suffering is a cross to bear until you die and go to Jesus, liberation theology was like, no, Jesus was on the side of the poor people, and your suffering is actually something to be resisted, that you can find liberation here on earth. You don't have to wait until you die. And so they use the Bible to like basically study the injustices around them and then talk about how do you counter those injustices. And so it starts in Latin America, but it does spread across the globe. And again, the Marian order was very instrumental, at least in bringing it to the United States. But it's also, you can see it in Africa as well. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that was very helpful, and I think raises some important observations about the way this emerges and the importance of the changes that were happening.
Yeah, and I think it's also like important to put that within the context of the 60s overall. Like for scholars of the 60s, like 1968 is a big year. It's like there's stuff going on in the United States, and there's stuff going on in Europe, right? Like lots of huge protests. You know, in Paris, there's like sense of revolution, you know, US, there's like protests at the Democratic National Convention, you know, like there's a lot going on. There's protests in Mexico over the Olympics. And that very same year is when the bishops meet in Medellin. So in some ways, like it's part of that whole kind of global revolutionary liberatory milieu that's going on at that time. So I think that's another way to think about it. It often gets like pushed to the side, but I would see it as very much a part of everything else.
Right, right. Well, thank you very much for taking time to share your work with us today, Professor Mollin. And I want to thank our audience for attending as well. It's been terrific to hear about this work, and we'll definitely be looking forward to the book that's coming out.
Me too. Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone. Thank you.